Okay. Okay, I think we're close enough. Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this evening for this great presentation we have. We're very lucky to be co-sponsoring with Solidarity Hall with Pete Davis and Elias Crim. I'm a longtime fan of Solidarity Hall, longtime listener, and just excited to be in dialogue with them. Just a few housekeeping items. If everybody could kindly mute themselves, just so we don't have any background noise since we're running this as a meeting. So that would be great. We are recording, as we just mentioned, so hopefully that will be fine for people. Let's see. So yeah, so we'll get right into it. We have tonight with us Pete Davis, who is a writer and reformer from Falls Church, Virginia, whose writing focuses on the project of deepening American democracy and solidarity. He's the director of the Democracy Policy Network, which is a state policy organization focused on raising up ideas that deepen democracy. And his latest book that we'll be talking about tonight is called Dedicated: The Case for Commitment in an Age of Infinite Browsing. It was brought out by Avid Reader Press of Simon & Schuster earlier this year. So I was actually looking at the Democracy Policy Network website today, just kind of see what was going on there, and was really floored by how quickly it's come up and how many great policy ideas they've got generating. So I encourage people to check that out too. And also joining us, Elias Crim, a writer, publisher, and founding editor of Solidarity Hall, which is a group blog and podcast focused on community renewal grounded in reflection. So I like those two words together. He's written for the American Scholar, Front Porch Republic, Strong Towns, and the New Herbs blog at the American Conservative. He and his family live in South Bend, Indiana. I would, as I've mentioned, highly recommend Solidarity Hall to people that are interested in TAC. Lots going on with civic life and kind of with a informed by Catholicism, but in a way that's, I think, just done very well. And they've got a lot of exciting projects that hopefully we'll hear about tonight. I'd like to hear more about the Economy of Francesco. So we could get right into it. Since we're kind of using Pete's book as maybe a jumping off point, Pete, I'm wondering if you could, I know we were just kind of joking about the many interviews, but if you could give us your just basic background for people who aren't familiar with your book, how it came into being. I'm particularly interested in, I know it grew out of your speech, your commencement address in 2018, and I'm just curious if you could talk a bit about why you selected this subject of commitment for that speech, why you felt that was kind of the single issue that maybe other issues could grow out of.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, first off, for having me. It's an honor to be here. I'm so inspired by the work that TAC does, and it's wonderful that you've had co-hosted this with Elias and Solidarity Hall, which is, one of the great inspirations for the themes that went into the speech and the book. And I'm wearing my Dorothy Day shirt today in honor of the hosts today. My favorite T-shirt in my wardrobe. So I had this wonderful opportunity to give a graduation speech 3 years ago, and that speech became the book. And it's a very interesting genre. It's a very interesting format of writing because it's like this ultimate question you're presented with, which is, what is the one message you want to give in 5 minutes that kind of speaks to people in your generation? And, when I was thinking about a lot of people my age, there's this really, and other ages, but, I kind of know my age better, is that there's this kind of common feeling that we're living in really dark times. We're living, it's a very cynical time. It's a very, some people feel very hopeless. There's a sense that community's in decline, that there's major political problems, that our institutions are corrupted and rusted, that hopes that we may have had 10 years ago for turning things around in politics and technology and culture did not pan out. The hopes were dashed. And there's this real sense of confusion and loss. This real question everyone asking, what should we do? And the message that we got from our elders in kind of higher education, most particularly, was this message of when asked, what should we do? They usually told us, the message was achieve on an individual level, advance yourself, and the form that usually took was this, what I kind of consider the creed of today, that is the antagonist of this book. This message of keep your options open. The
Mhm.
best thing you can do with all these things changing, with all this confusion, is don't get tied down to anything particular, because you never know what tomorrow is going to bring. So the best thing you can do is keep as many doors open on the hallway of life, keep as many options open, so that as things change, you'll still have options to take. And there was also, when we were, another thing was, in culture, kind of outside of our elders, the big thing that took off in my generation was this kind of culture of internal wellness.
Mhm.
This idea that there are all these bad things out there, but we can worry about caring for ourselves. Self care being the common phrase that a lot of people use. We can mitigate the effects of all the bad things out there by taking care. And, I look at these two messages, one of achievement and one of kind of solely self care. And, the feeling was this is not enough. It doesn't address the problems out there in the world. It doesn't revive our institutions. It doesn't bring together community. It doesn't solve our political problems. It doesn't provide hope. And it doesn't even help us internally. It doesn't give us purpose. It doesn't give us meaning. It doesn't let us go to sleep at night and feel calm. It actually contributes to a lot of individual anxiety. And so I wanted to look for an alternative to keeping your options open. And the thing that kept coming up was this message of commitment. This
Mhm.
idea that there were some people, it actually came from observing the people that seemed to have solved public problems, that had an impact, that had revived institutions, that provide hope, that were earning respect, that were feeling at peace, that were most importantly feeling joy. They were people who were long haul heroes. They were people who worked at something for a long time. They were people who were dedicated to a particular thing outside of themselves, a person, a place, an institution, a cause, a craft, a community. And they were willing to close doors and forgo options for the sake of that particular thing that they loved outside themselves. And so the message of the speech, which became the message of the book, is in this darkness of our time, in this time of individual anxiety and public problems, don't necessarily keep your options open. Instead, the way out, a path out, a light in the darkness, is the single act of the opposite, dedicating yourself to a particular thing. So this is the book is a tribute to the long haul heroes that have done this, and a call to action to join their counterculture of commitment by ignore rebelling from the creed of keeping our options open, and making commitments.
Yes. No, that's it's definitely the message for the time, I think. And one thing as I was reading the book, I was curious your thoughts on this, and this might be a way to kind of open this up into some discussion about civics and Catholic life and things. But I wondered what you thought about the work of commitment is not just hard, but it's also hidden at many times. It's also things we do anonymously. It's things we might do without being noticed. And there's so much pressure on, I think, younger generations to kind of market oneself, or to, everybody's kind of branding oneself. And the work of commitment's almost countercultural to that. And you have to be okay with anonymity, or just with doing things quietly, maybe in a local place. And I don't even know if this is a question or just a response I had, but I was thinking a lot about kind of the way the Catholic tradition talks about. There's a lot about hiddenness, the hidden person of the heart and things in Peter. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about, you know, rooting down in a place versus kind of putting oneself out there. There's this idea that, he got out of town. We have to leave town to kind of forge ourselves versus coming back to where we're from. Um, did that enter into the book at all from a Catholic perspective?
Yeah, no, totally. I have two kind of big thoughts on that, connected to the book. So, one, just, the real reason why I think this is a second path, and why I kind of talk about that wellness stuff at the beginning, um, is because, there's this kind of hall of mirrors, corn maze, that you can get lost in. I'm mixing metaphors. A hall of mirrors, let's keep it that you can get lost in when you think, oh gosh, there's all these problems out there and there's all these anxieties I feel about them. I need to think about myself. I need to keep constantly rewriting my own narrative. Who am I? What am I doing? The psychodrama of finding your place in the midst of all of this. And there's some help you can get from doing that. It's good to spend some time thinking about, at least some time in your life, to think about yourself. But if you go a little too far down that, you end up having the healing that you're seeking become kind of eat its own tail of like, and become this hall of mirrors where it's like, oh, am I this? Am I this? Oh, I need to do this other treatment to solve this. Oh, it turns out that didn't work out, so I need to do this. I. And I don't want to be like a finger wagging moralist against, people and say, get out of yourself. But really, I've just seen people suffer, and I've gone down that rabbit hole of suffering, of just trying to find different configurations of who am I, and then finding that the more I spend when I get too far down that path, it becomes a dead end. And then there are the finger wagging moralists that say, well, get out of yourself, stop being narcissistic, stop being selfish. But that's not the best way to educate someone to do it. I talk about in the book, my doctor, Dr. Lee, when he's helping me try to quit soda, I'm like a soda addict. He says, oh, don't keep beating yourself up over quitting soda. Just say to yourself, I should drink more water, because an alternative is much better than a no finger wagging at something. So what's the alternative to the narcissism, to the hall of mirrors of constantly thinking about yourself? It's not telling yourself, oh gosh, I got to be less selfish. It's growing relationships outside of yourself with particular things that, and this is getting to the answer of what you were saying, or one thought on what you were saying, by growing that relationship, by becoming rooted in a place, by becoming rooted to an institution, by falling into a cause, by caring for a person, by joining a craft practice, naturally, from doing that, from that positive action, you stop thinking about I less. You start thinking about we more. You start thinking about you more. You start thinking about God more. You start thinking about the beauty that comes from this, and the truth that comes from this, and the goodness that comes from these relationships. And so one of the messages of commitment is it's just a path to free ourselves from the constant thinking about ourselves. And very quickly, just kind of the second thought on that, what that work eventually becomes, I talk about the difference in the book between Hollywood heroism versus long haul heroism. In Hollywood heroism, the heroism's all about a big brave moment. The dragon comes, you have the big moment where you give the epic speech and you slay the dragon, or you give the best callback, or you have the giant march in the streets. But that's rarely how anything ever happens in the world, and that's rarely what we're presented with on a day-to-day level. What really happens is usually, with advancing a cause, it's a lot of meetings. Right. With mentoring someone. I talked to mentors for the book and the major mentoring program in DC, and they said, I would take a uncharismatic mentor that's willing to show up every month for their mentee and say, I choose you today to hang out with you, than the most charismatic, most cool to the teens, flaky guy as a mentor. Because what people need in the end is someone who keeps showing up and being a companion. What places need are people that keep showing up and thinking about how to improve them. What institutions need are stewards that keep the rituals going. What causes need are the people that do what Max Weber called the slow boring of hard boards. That's what he called politics. It's the long haul, day in, day out, week in, week out, year in, year out work. And that's usually humble and quiet and steady, not flashy and singular.
Right. I love the example you've given in the book of Martin Luther King attending his thousandth planning meeting, that we don't often think about. We think about him on the, front lines at Selma or something. But we don't think about all the work that went in behind the scenes that was done totally without that kind of immediate gratification, immediate reward, the slow build. We're in such a time of where our institutions feel so rickety and so shaky. And I wonder what the both of you think. Elias, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. Your thoughts on, not that I feel there's a division between the project of church reform, if you're sympathetic to the idea of maybe a more democratic lay-run Catholic Church and maybe, civic projects. I'm wondering what you feel about how those two projects work together, or if we should be focused on one over the other, or I know a lot of people in attendance and a lot of work TAC's done over the years has been with thinking about smaller church communities, small church groups. I don't know, it just seems like we're in a time of maybe decentralization. So I wonder, should we think about rebuilding institutions kind of collectively as these large things, or should we kind of keep with the trend of decentralization and maybe build up some smaller communities where we find ourselves? I guess that's broadly, I think a lot about how that works within the church, but also maybe within our civic institutions as well. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Elias, why don't you go first? You have such great.
I was going to invite Pete first. Well, let's see. In a way, that's two different subjects, and in a way, they have a common thread, right? Let me start on the church side, just to throw something out there. Then maybe Pete can pick up on the civic side. I want to mention an organization that maybe fits into this category of decentralizing and reimagining church, and I wonder if maybe several people here in this group might know of it. It's called Nuns and Nuns. That's Nunes and Nones. So it's a group of older religious women and another group of mostly younger women. A few men are in the group. And a few years ago, they got together. I don't know exactly the circumstances, but it was a younger group of progressive-minded women. I don't know how many were Catholic, maybe not very many. I think most of them had some kind of spiritual quest, perhaps. But they realized that these older women religious had had a remarkable history in American culture and American politics of really being there first on so many issues, whether it was green, anti-war, civil rights. These women working exactly as you were saying, Michael, kind of quietly, anonymously, have a certain group of them have been doing just heroic stuff for a long time. And these younger women in particular wanted that wisdom in this time. And so now there are several circles of nuns and nuns around the country. They don't really have exactly an agenda other than accompaniment, but they're also beginning to talk about some kind of shared practice. It's a very curious thing. It's really not denominational. It's not really theological. It is broadly spiritual, but it was also just, a movement of the Spirit. This didn't come from the bishops. It was just a group of people, again, mostly women, who wanted to share something. It's also interesting, not to go on too long about this particular group, but it's also interesting because obviously these older women know that their way of life is disappearing. Their institutions are gradually disappearing. So there's a lot that they would like to give and share. And these younger women are the beneficiaries of that. So in that way, there's something very decentralized and unorganized that's very hopeful going on around understandings of spirituality anyway. I also think, we may be at a point where, as has happened, I think before in church history, I'm not a church historian, but I think the laity, isn't it the case that time and again, it's the laity that get together and realize something is needed, something is missing, and then sooner or later, the clerisy, the clerics, and the bishops decide, yeah, well, I guess that's a good idea. Mm-hmm. So that may be what's underway. It's hard to see because it is disorganized and dispersed, but it's really my hope at the moment, because it's where the faith seems to be alive. It doesn't seem to be lurking in all the usual places.
Right. I wonder, Elias, if I could just follow up quickly on that. I read your article in America, I believe it was a few months ago, on Michael Martin's place in Ann Arbor. I wonder if you could speak to us a little about that. I was very first of all, I was just glad to know about his work, because there are a lot of resonances with things I'm very interested in, the relationship between poetry and spirituality, and
Mhm.
his liturgical practices.
Mhm.
So could you talk a bit about maybe that experience and where it might fit in as a model for some type of alternate or decentralized church community?
Yeah. I would describe Michael's work as sort of cultural, educational. I think the wonderful thing that Michael could do is start some kind of a school, and the school would be about recovering a kind of a deeper sense of culture, a very Catholic sense of culture. He's drawing from a theological tradition that's pretty much unknown or forgotten in the West, and that is certain forms of Eastern Orthodoxy. He's very interested in figures like Solovyov and Berjayev, and in a kind of a literary or poetic way, he's written a book about sophiology. And sophiology is something that sounds kind of weird or occult, but it really is kind of a very integral, to use a term that's popular in spirituality now, it's a very integral understanding of body and spirit. The figures in this tradition are people like William Blake, Thomas Traherne. It's nothing necessarily very weird or cultish, but it is somewhat unknown. So Michael is a literary critic, he's a poet, he's a scholar, and he's a great fan of a very decentralized kind of education, sort of like Waldorf schools plus liturgy.
Yeah.
A bit like that.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting figure.
Very nice. I will definitely I want to read more of his works. Maybe this brings us to a good point, just about, we're talking about some of these, more specifically Catholic ideas of understanding the world. And we're also talking about civic institutions. Sometimes it feels hard to import one into the other without falling into culture war traps, or just places we don't seem to get anywhere. I mean, we're divided not only within our society, we're divided within our church too. And those things sometimes bounce off each other and reflect off each other in ways that don't feel very productive. So I'm curious how the two of you navigate that, and strategies you can recommend for engaging with maybe others who don't think like us, or and the Catholic Church has so much we can draw on, the sacramental imagination and kind of ways of building consensus. And we have so much I think we can offer, the public square. How do we do it in a way that's not self-righteous or not judgmental? I know it's maybe a broad or big question, but if you could share any of your experience with that, since you both work in, somewhat in both realms.
Yeah, I'll say one idea that's been really inspiring to me about divides. That is and what I think the Catholic flavored version of this idea is, which is so I used to work for Ralph Nader in his kind of continued activist work, and he when I was working for him, he was on this real big left right overlap kick, and how to find ways to connect people. And he told me this idea that I loved, which is, he said, it is the common view that we all agree on the abstract principles, but we disagree in how to implement the abstract principles. So that's like a trite thing that people sometimes say, like, we all agree in equality and freedom and justice, but we disagree on how it manifests in the concrete way. But what Nader said is, he said, it's actually quite the opposite. We all totally disagree on our abstract principles, but occasionally we might find concrete projects where our varying, warring abstract principles might overlap. So the answer is to get more concrete, not more abstract. And a lot of these like making red and blue, or the different sides of the culture war come together, they all start with the abstract. They say, oh, let's start by having the extremists on both sides come and, have an abstract conversation. And he says we should do the exact opposite. Okay. And so now, where does Catholicism come in? We are some of the great abstraction folks, but we're also some of the great concrete folks. What is one of the great Catholic concreteness spirits? The works of mercy. There are people that are hungry that need to be fed. There are people that are thirsty that need drink. There are people in prison that need to be visited, et cetera, et cetera. Those are concrete acts. And my commitment angle on that is it's not just kind of the, high school service project where you kind of make the lunch trays and hand them off to have someone go, deliver them right before Christmas or Thanksgiving. I would say we need to have the dedicated works of mercy, which is enter into the long-term relationships with the people in prison that need to be visited, the hungry that need to be fed, the homeless that need to be sheltered. And
Yes.
in that local work, I know that can, we've seen examples of how that can bridge divides, and not only just bridge rigid divides, but actually melt down divides. Again, another Catholic idea that when you have those interactions, when you work together with different people, when you see people who are different than you, people on the margins, like Jane Addams tried to do with the settlement houses, to try to bring people from one neighborhood in Chicago to another neighborhood in Chicago, not just to serve them from on high, but to enter into relationship together. Dorothy Day as well. Those differences the abstract differences begin to melt in the concrete realities. And I'm just a big believer in that. And I think the answer maybe for the Catholic culture war is, can we have our proof of devotion not just be the cant of, our fundamentalist abstract precepts, but the sacrifice of time and energy and vulnerability to the concrete works of mercy.
Amen. Amen. No, what comes to mind when you were speaking was Greg Boyle, the Homeboy Industries out in Los Angeles, I think is a beautiful example of, like he says, going to the margins so the margins disappear. And like you were saying, Pete, this idea of a sustained relationship, it almost goes back to what you were saying with the mentor-mentoree, showing up for one person on a regular basis rather than maybe dropping in and dropping out, and kind of depending more on rhetoric. So I think I love that idea of starting with the concrete rather than the abstract. And that might open, I know we kind of mentioned this in our emails, and I know, forgive me if this is another kind of broad question, but just it's something that I've seen a lot come up in the discourse recently. And I actually was on my radar. I remember when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez went down to Texas, and she came back after the storm in February and said, charity is no substitute for good governance. And I've seen a lot of iterations of this within certain Catholic spaces, thinking more critically about charity, like you were saying, Pete, is just kind of packaging the thing and packaging the lunch tray and giving it away, versus the A, policy, and B, the sustained relationship of really, service. How do you both see the relationship between charity and policy, and should we be, I don't know how to say this, but should we be thinking about one over the other, or how can they work more in confluence? Is it maybe it's obvious? I think it's obviously a both and, but how do we maybe employ them on even more robust level?
You could argue that there's a certain kind of charitable project which turns into a demo plot for something bigger.
Mm.
So I think what's interesting is when you've got, as in the town I'm in South Bend, Indiana, which happens to have a real cohort of sort of younger people, activists. And the key thread for these people is that they just love their city. It's not because they have great careers here. It's not because South Bend is overflowing with opportunity. Quite the contrary. But for whatever reasons, they have just decided to maybe be long haulers, exactly as Pete is describing. And when you do that work and you build things, I think there's an argument that Sarah Horowitz makes this point in her book, Mutualism, which is a good book, recent book. She's saying that when you look at the origins of the New Deal, where did the New Deal come from? These big policy decisions. I actually, myself, I had the idea it came from, paneled rooms in DC. It was top down, that sort of thing. That's really not quite right. it turns out that, as makes sense, to create social programs at a big scale, you had to go find what was working. You had to go to New York and look at Jewish social service agencies. You had to go to California and look at the ag co-ops. You had to go to the Deep South and look at the way Black farmers came together to help each other in various kinds of mutual associations and so on. So that work, which preceded the New Deal, that was all seedlings of something much bigger. So that's a kind of a utilitarian argument. I think there's another thing that kind of work is also valuable for, and it's a word that comes up in Pope Francis' new book, Let Us Dream, which is a wonderful book. Encounter. So I remember he said long ago that we should go out to the peripheries. And the truth is, I didn't quite get what that meant. I thought maybe he was talking about, getting on a plane and going to Haiti or something. And I finally realized that was not necessary. I live in Northwest Indiana. I'm actually more to the Northeast now, but at the time I was in Northwest Indiana. So what I decided to do was, one, go to the Spanish language mass at my own parish, where there was a whole group of people I didn't know at all, and I could barely get through the service trying to understand what was going on. And then the other thing I did was go over to Gary, the town of Gary, Indiana, which is a kind of a dying community in a lot of ways, but they're down to one African-American Catholic parish with a handful of white and Hispanic parishioners. And I dropped in, and it was just fantastic, just a fantastic experience. So it was a periphery to me, but it was where I encountered, my neighbors in a way. And in a way, I think what would overcome the divisions that you were talking about in the previous question is repeating those encounters, so that suddenly you begin to see that these other people are not really different. They're not enemies. They're very like-minded. And more than that, we should all get together and fix something.
I love that. If I can echo and build on some of that.
Please.
Yeah, I think we over separate different civic actions. And I'm a big proponent of simplifying and making everything seem much more ordinary. So, and putting them all on a spectrum, not in like separate categories. So, and talking about them in a kind of day-to-day sense instead of a grand sense. So, charity, what is it? It's some projects or people need money, and so occasionally you got to give money. Sometimes volunteering, what is that? Sometimes projects and people need time. You got to give time. What is politics? Sometimes, we all work together through government to set the rules of the road and split the commonwealth. That needs your voice, and your voice, you kind of advance your interests and ideals and the interests and ideals of those you care about when you get a shot at raising your voice and advocating for things when we're deciding what the rules of the road and the split of the commonwealth is. And all of those are just acts of, you do those all because you care about yourself and you care about others. And you do different things to make them all work. Sometimes it's voice, sometimes it's time, sometimes it's public work, sometimes it's ideas, sometimes it's money. And but this is where Elias's point is so wonderful. It's what is the kind of part that I just said that has to do with that? It's like, well, you do it for the people you care about. And what is solidarity? Solidarity is caring about people. And how do you build a wider solidarity? You have encounters. And what are we called to as Catholics? To build a wider community of solidarity that we're within. And so we're called to not let our we get closed. We're called to open up our we and actually never get comfortable with our we. Always look for, who are we missing? What are we omitting? What is, in the words of Father James Keenan, what are the times that we're failing to bother to love, which is what he defines sin as, failing to bother to love? How can we enact mercy, which is, he defines as the willingness to enter into the chaos of others? And when you have those encounters, when you bother to love, that encounter grows into a relationship, which grows into solidarity and love and care, which you'll enact in all the ways that you have access to enact that love, which is giving money, giving time, giving ideas, and giving votes and advocacy as well.
Mm.
And you know, one final thing on that thought is one other phrase I love. This philosopher I'm a big fan of, Roberto Unger, says he has this line: "Our interests are nailed to the cross of our institutions." Or our ideals are nailed to the cross of our institutions. I got that wrong. Our ideals are nailed to the cross of our institutions. And what he meant by that is this is a very there's kind of a to make a slight joke. There's a kind of Protestant thought that you can have floating moral ideals absent of institutions, that you can just like feel like you must do something because it's good or something, and you just hit yourself and say, I alone as an individual must promote this moral ideal. But when he says our ideals are nailed to the cross of our institutions, is we need help from our institutions to enact our ideals. Our ideals will eventually conform to our institutions. And so the final thing on Elias's point on encounter and on solidarity is we need institutions that push us to encounter people, that make it, in the words of Dorothy Day, easier to be good. We need settlement houses and Catholic worker houses and transfer programs and community dinners where you bring someone in one part of town to some part of the other town. And when you have the extra bandwidth and skills and charisma to be a leader, don't just do it in your own life. Create the institution that helps other people have that encounter and solidarity building as well.
Mm.
And that is something I think the church can be the mega institution of our world, and our parishes can be to be the institution that promotes the ideal of the act of encounter. So sorry for the long-winded.
No, that's excellent. It's actually very helpful to hear about, first of all, not having to always create this taxonomy of where this fits and where that fits, and just think about, it kind of comes back to the commitment idea of just the concrete, pick a problem and dive in, and things will kind of keep revealing themselves. And I also love the idea of the parish. The parish is kind of the center of the network and building out from there. I know, sometimes I know we're fans of strong towns, which I recommend to everybody. Chuck Mahone's has I guess, kind of think tank, but also publishing arm, but also podcasts about building community, but urban design and smart zoning. Sometimes I was thinking, what would some ideas be about, constructing smart parishes? Sometimes I feel like at least in my experience in a somewhat suburban environment, sometimes I feel like I'm there for an hour and then maybe I don't feel as connected to it as a place, or there's all this open space around it. Maybe there could be a garden where, that could be a way to, help feed some of the community. There's things of building out from the parish is kind of a central point. That's Elias, I liked your story of going out to individual parishes and just meeting people as a place to start. I guess maybe, I know, Elias, I want to touch on, there's kind of two directions we could go, but I know you've done a lot of work with, this might tie in with the parish idea. You've done a lot of work with cooperative economics, which I am trying to learn a bit more about. I'm new to it. It's new to a lot of us, but I've been following Nathan Schneider's work and some of the others.
Great.
Paul. Some of the economy of Francesco touches on it. One thing, when I was kind of preparing for this evening, I was reading a little bit, and maybe you have some insight into this. I read a lot in the Catholic media, the idea of trusteeism as a former, as an idea. Do you know anything about this? If it's something that could be in the Catholic conversation, where, to my understanding, it's lay ownership, or at least lay administration of parish property. Is that something we should be thinking about, advocating for, etc.?
Could be. And in a way, we have sort of a version of that. I mean, most of the time, it really just means a kind of a parish board, sort of like a nonprofit would have a board. But there are other versions of it, other applications of it. For example, here's a a striking idea borrowed from the Europeans. In Europe, there are a number of very large corporations which are actually organized as trusts, stewardship trusts. And that means that they cannot be sold. It means that they have a mission. It means that they have certain standards. It means that there's a voting arrangement whereby it is very democratic, a bit like a co-op, but ultimately the board of the trust controls the fate of the corporation. So that means no hostile takeovers. It means no private equity moves. It means you have the ability to create an organization and for a century or so, keep it devoted to the same ideals, the same way of doing business, the same mission as when it was founded. This is unheard of in the American context, but there are a few organizations that are converting to steward trusteeship, steward ownership in this country as a way of sharing ownership, widening ownership. It could certainly apply in a church context, although that's not a commercial organization. But what I think of in the church context is not so much, new structures as the very pressing need, which I feel just down the road from me in Chicago, for example, to restructure churches. So we have a really painful process underway in the Archdiocese of Chicago. They are closing parishes. There's a strange kind of dissatisfying lottery system, some people would say, by which out of 3 parishes we'll keep 2, and we sort of draw straws. In theory, at sort of the management level, this sounds fine. And then down at the street level, you discover you're talking about real neighborhoods that have been around for a long time. You're talking about culture, tradition, family history. And so this process, of course, is not merely a financial decision. It is also not merely a decision that a handful of, community meetings are going to fix. It's really an overwhelming problem. And so I don't think the Archdiocese of Chicago or anywhere else that there's an older kind of Rust Belt situation has found a satisfactory solution. But some people would say, surely part of the solution is to take this asset, the church and the property, and whatever the market is saying, turn this over to a group of people who are spiritually driven, who have the right kinds of progressive ideals, and turn this back over to the community, which was the original idea for creating the parish in the first place. So maybe this building, maybe the structure, maybe this land is not going to be, sacred any longer, but that doesn't mean we don't have an obligation to make sure the next phase for all of these assets is not just, equitable, and grounded in our own traditions, So that's a Rust Belt kind of Chicago, Buffalo, that kind of problem. It's not a problem that they have in, say, Phoenix or Houston, probably, where they're building churches. But in older communities, the problem of church assets, it's not just a Catholic problem. The Episcopalians have a lot to say about this. The Methodists have a lot to say about this, and so on and so on. Young people are not coming. And so we've reached a point, and there are many conversations going on about, for example, taking a Black church, which is on the verge of gentrification, forming a trust or something like that, buying the property, and then finding a way to redistribute those assets to church members before the developers get it. It's very difficult to do. Most of the time, it's, you can't quite get there in time. But there's at least a realization that that is part of the work that churches ought to be doing, given the current circumstances. And that's wonderful work. That's wonderful redemptive work, as much as, organizing a new committee at the parish. So, but we don't normally think of it that way.
Right. No, I've heard of the idea of partnering parishes with maybe a parish that is not taking in as much funds with a parish that is, which I think is one way to do it. But I really, it's a very intriguing idea of there's almost kind of a healthy detachment if the building could even go to another use, not thinking
Yes.
just about our tradition. I think that's kind of a Catholic
Yes.
Christian response in a way. Just I
Right.
know in the parish, the church I was baptized in, actually in a part of town across the river from me, it's got such, I mean, I don't want to say it's a lively parish, people attend, but the area around has such there's such dynamic potential. It's by the river, and the parish could really be like a hub.
Yes.
You know, so there's a lot of potential to think about, and we have to, I like that idea of maybe non-attachment or thinking in new ways. Interesting. I want to mention to everybody here, if you do have questions, please feel free to direct message, or I'm still learning all the features of Zoom. I think there might be a hand raise feature, or just chime in. We're a small enough group, so if anybody has any questions or thoughts, please feel free. You know, in the meantime, maybe this was another direction I thought, in this, Elias and Pete, I'm interested in maybe both of your thoughts. The statement for Solidarity Hall is community grounded in reflection, and I just love those two. It's a similar kind of idea of what we're trying to do at TAC, where we're thinking about going outward, but also, you know, the old action contemplation thing. What could we maybe learn? It always calls to mind the monastic tradition for me. And I know there's a lot of conversations about what we can learn from monastic movements, how we can import those things into the way we start structuring our towns, structuring our churches. Have you encountered that? I know Giorgio Agamben, I think Nathan Schneider reviewed Agamben's book on the Franciscan rule that touched on a lot of these themes. Do you have any thoughts about, and again, Elias, it kind of touches back on what you were saying earlier with the nuns and the nones. Some of these traditions are seeing, they might need to find new iterations of being, new ways of being. Are you seeing things out there, or I don't know, thoughts just about the impact of monastic tradition on kind of what we're doing in our public spaces?
I'll let Pete go ahead if he's got anything.
You go first with this, Elias.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what I've seen. You know, other than what I remarked on with nuns and nuns, and you know, I am aware that the new monastic movement, which is not so new anymore, is still a thing. It started up about 10 years ago. This is Shane Claiborne, the I don't want to call him an evangelical. He's a Protestant, a radical Christian Protestant, and he has a community, I believe, in Philadelphia. I think there's a fair amount of this. I don't really have much of a sense for it, but I think just informally, there are little groups of mostly sort of Bible Christians, as they're called, sometimes Catholics too, that do this. And I don't know that it's all that organized. There's a group called Ecclesia, spelled with 2 Ks, that is more like a network. One of the leaders of the group is a guy named Michael Budde, who teaches at DePaul, Budde. He's a wonderful writer on Catholicism and politics. And so it's a little bit like the Catholic worker universe in a way, which maybe it's, you know, the Catholic worker universe is a collection of anarchists, right? So how do you generalize about a collection of anarchists?
Right.
They don't hold annual meetings, you know, but they do have some common threads, and I have a sense they may be morphing a little bit. I'm aware of a Catholic worker house in Portland. They are very interested in co-ops. They are attempting to create a kind of local community bank in a way, or at least a kind of a micro lending service through a couple of parishes. They're very locally focused. So that's a sign that, you know, maybe the Catholic worker model might even be changing in some ways. We don't live in Dorothy Day's Depression era, you know. I had a conversation with some people about starting a Catholic worker house in Gary, Indiana. And the reason ultimately we couldn't do it was because the city of Gary is so depopulated. There really is no place to put a Catholic worker house where people would be likely to walk up to the door.
Mm.
You know, it's a city that's mostly empty, which is quite a weird thing.
Yeah.
And so if you want the old model of hospitality, you need to be in an area of a certain density, as Dorothy had on the Lower East Side or wherever it was. So on the other hand, you have Catholic worker houses that are sometimes maybe an ag co-op, or, you know, sometimes I know a pregnancy rescue kind of Catholic worker group. There's a million different kinds. So there's no kind of one theme. But I think some new models probably are arriving. And someone told me, of all the ministries of the Catholic Church, the only one in which there is a falling average age is the Catholic worker group.
Interesting. Yeah, that might be the way forward.
Could be.
Yeah.
Our podcast on Solidarity Hall is called it's called Dorothy's Place, but wasn't there something called the Dorothy option at one point, Elias?
That's interesting. Was that kind of a rejoinder to the Benedict?
It was.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
I feel
Yep.
Elias came up with it, but I feel I'll do my interpretation, but we can the author, death of the author. But I don't know how we can let Elias say his, which is, you know, I do think there was something really compelling about the Benedict option. But it was not enough. You know, there was something wrong with it, but there was, you cannot deny the compellingness of the basic idea of let's have at least part of ourselves extract from the shallowness of the modern time and find a depth again and find the light again, which is like monasticism. The problem is you can't, you know, that's wrong. It's wrong to leave the world. You must engage with the world. Yep. We're called to engage with the world. And so I've always thought, when you came up with the idea of Dorothy's option, the Dorothy option, Elias, it's this challenge of kind of figuring out how do you take the idea of the Benedict option, which is to try to have a group of people voluntarily deciding to, instead of putting all their energy to fighting the modern war, to, you know, prefiguring alternatives with the need that we, you know, the absolute calling that we can't extract ourselves from the world and the time that we're in. And I think there is ways, you know, some things that have inspired me is just, you know, having organizations that mix action in the world, you know, doing the works of mercy, doing, you know, being involved in the political questions of the day, addressing the problems of the city, and being a participant with, amongst themselves, as people that are kind of all on board in this way of doing things, having times where they have reflection and are a community of reflection on their work. And, you know, and I think there's a lot of great examples out there in civics outside of Catholicism where, you know, you have environmental groups that, you know, go out there and join coalitions to fight for the cause of the day, but then they have a lot of internal back and forth about things. You have groups like the Democratic Socialists of America that go participate in local ballot initiatives and help elect candidates. People sometimes falsely think of these DSA young people as radicals who are too pure, when in fact they're the opposite. They're breaking from a left that is too pure to actually engage in the world. But if you go to any of their meetings or you go to their conference or you read their internal magazine, it's a lot of shared reflection in their own language that no one can understand from the outside. And I think we could have groups like that where you have times for reflection and times for action.
Yep. I just came across a great phrase today in an article, cultural liturgies, that I really liked, from James K. Smith, talking about how we need to start thinking about how we can have, as a culture, kind of a liturgical idea, not confined to a Catholic tradition or this tradition, but just more liturgical life in general.
I'll offer a quick explanation on the Dorothy option, which I admit was a little bit in response to the sort of dismaying popularity of Rod Dreher's book. So it was a blog. I no longer do it. It was a blog on the Catholic Pathos channel. But, one of the things that I was thinking about was a different way of being Catholic, somewhat in Dorothy's vein. And, I'm intrigued with the idea from a Jesuit writer named Dean Brackley of downward mobility. We could all imagine how that might go over at a Sunday homily if the priest got up and started explaining how we Americans need to think more about downward mobility and what that might mean. Friendship with the poor, solidarity with the poor. Pope Francis has done some very good things, and one of them is sort of help re-engineer liberation theology. It's sort of a different thing to a degree. It's 2.0, and what he did was simply take out sort of some of the more ideological stuff, the narrowly sort of Marxist stuff. Gustavo Gutierrez was perfectly happy to help him do that. And I think the burden now is on particularly American Catholics to realize we are Americans of a continent, not just a country. And there's a great contribution that has come from Latin America. And I don't mean just Pope Francis, I mean before that, all of that reflection, going back to the bishops' conferences in Medellin and so on. Americans don't know much about it. They don't know a lot about liberation theology in terms of what it really meant, local Bible studies in areas where there was no priest and so on. It was never about just pure politics. It was always heavily spiritual. But all of that is kind of alien to our sort of bourgeois Christianity, which is a very, very difficult thing to get over. And beyond that, if you think about our political moment, you could argue we are, as American Christians, beyond Catholics, really in a kind of a theological crisis. How did we get to this moment, in terms of public faith? It is a very dismaying thing. And I don't think we should get too, hyperbolic about it, but it seems extreme. And it seems that we all have a handful of bishops that seem particularly concerned about it. A friend of mine pointed out they're mostly border bishops. The border bishops are pretty connected to reality. But on the whole, they haven't been very helpful, let's say. So the example of Dorothy and other figures we could think of, I think are going to be very important to get us through what's coming, these multiple cascading crises. And so notions like downward mobility, but also Gutierrez has this wonderful idea of communal spirituality. I remember reading about this and thinking, what in the world is that? I've only heard of individual spirituality. You can only do it one at a time, right? No, he's saying, if you understand the history of theology, theological ideas come up from spirituality. They're all the fruit of spirituality. And in most cases, they were a fruit of a kind of communal spirituality, which we no longer understand because we have privatized our faith. So I think that's great stuff. And it needs to be a wider conversation. I think it's the only way forward for Catholics.
Yes. No, definitely. And yeah, looking to the global South in new ways and what we can learn from them, not just.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's key. I heard the word boreocentrism the other day about kind of the northern, thinking always about the north, and yep. When we're on this continent, and we have to remember the globe can very easily, it's a sphere, it can turn all ways.
That's right.
Yeah. So maybe we can pivot a bit. Pete, I might want to touch back brief on Dedicate a little bit more, just to talk a little bit more about people who aren't familiar with the book, if you don't mind. I wonder if you could tell, there's a great story, and I know you've told it a few times, but I think it really illustrates the book. If you could just give us a quick run through of, I believe his name is Dave, the gentleman from your hometown, Falls Church, who started with one park and then kind of kept building outward on his sense of commitment. I don't know if you could just kind of run through his story and how that idea figured into the book. I just love it as an example.
I told, one of my favorite phrases, I think it's Nietzsche, is all philosophy is biography, which is, we usually come to our beliefs through something that happened in our life. And I told this really clean story at the beginning of this talk on, the perfect way I thought about unfolding the idea of commitment. But the other way, that's probably the more true way, is I just had a lot of long haul heroes when I was growing up that lit a fire in me of like, I was totally fascinated by them. They caught my admiration. And one of them was this couple, Dave Eckert and Annette Mills. I grew up in this town, Falls Church, Virginia, right outside DC. It's a little town, a single stream school system where, you're with the same people in kindergarten that you're in high school. And we have a kind of very vibrant civic life. And the super citizens of Falls Church were Dave Eckert and Annette Mills. They were involved in everything. And I saw them everywhere, and they were always working on these projects, and it was always so inspiring. Some of them were hunky dory, some of them were fighting City Hall. You'd see the mayor sometimes like, they're bothering me, and other times they'd be like cutting the ribbon with them. It was like this amazing couple that was behind everything. And so when I started writing the book, I called them and I said, I want to know the full story. How did you come to be? Because, one way to put my book is, I just want to make more people like y'all. What is so what's the story? And they said they moved to Falls Church, and Dave Eckert, he got really he was vaguely an environmentalist. He wasn't that committed, but he got into the fact that there was this one tract of land in the middle of the town that had a tiny stream running through it. And it was in the paper that week that they were going to just do a housing development on this tiny tract of land, and we're a small town and there's not many parks. And he's like, we have this one, park, this woodland that wasn't even developed into a park. It was just like woodland owned by the city, and the city was going to sell it and let it be developed and things like that. And he started fighting, and he went to the press, and he like used all these dramatic statements to say what they were doing to the land. And the city basically called his bluff and said, why don't you join the tree commission if you care so much about the trees? And he's like, oh gosh, I just wanted to complain. But he's like, okay, I'm going to call their bluff. And they're hoping he wasn't going to join the tree commission. So he joined the tree commission. And then he's like, oh, well, the commission alone can't do things, so I need to join the major civic organization, which is the Village Preservation Improvement Society. So he joins the Village Preservation Improvement Society. And then he's like, I want to make the case for this piece of land. And so he looks up the history of the land in the Falls Church Historic Society and finds out this whole history and writes up this whole history of the land and writes it in the newspaper. Then he gets a local like naturalist to discover that there was this waterfront underneath, and they need to raise up the waterfront, and it could be this waterfront. And he like then makes a whole documentary, because he's like, no one's reading we're in the like it's the 80s and 90s, no one's reading anymore, they only want visuals. So he starts making a documentary about this piece of land, and then he starts getting close to the public television station, because that's the only place that'll play his little documentary about the piece of land. Then, sorry, I'll cut this off short. I won't give you the long version, but then he's like, everyone's accusing us environmentalists and conservationists in town of being like white bread, or white upper class people who want our trees, but we're not in the real world. And he's like, that's right. It's a lot of guys that look like me in the Environment Tree Saving Club. So I'm going to get involved in the Black community in Falls Church. And he discovers there's this incredible historic era at the turn of the century where the first rural NAACP was in Falls Church. And so he starts a Black History and Blues Festival to like earn the trust with the families that are the descendants of the original NAACP. And then eventually, as a detail in his life, he won and they turned it into a park. But by that point, He was running a Black History Blues festival. He was on the Reorganization Society. Because he was on the tree commission, he had to think up other things. So he helped with the neighborhood tree program with his wife, Annette. They were so involved in civic life, they started being like, oh, why don't we have a New Year's festival? So they started a New Year's thing where we drop the biggest city crane, drops a star from the crane to try to have our own Times Square. He started being like, it's so hard to do these civic groups. Final thing, it's so hard to do these civic groups is because we don't know each other enough. So he starts a concert program where people host concerts in their home. So it pairs everyone learning about music, but also learning, like having the intimacy of being inside of each other's homes. And he learned that because he looked up the history of the Village Preservation Society in Falls Church, and they used to do that in the 20s. And he's like, why don't we revive that? And so the way he became a super citizen was because he fell in love with one thing and he was committed to it. And the reason I love telling a story, of which you probably get the moral of already, I don't need to be didactic about it, but the reason I love telling a story is commitments are like living things. This is like planting a seed and it becoming a rainforest, becoming a rainforest eventually. It's when you love, people tell young people, oh, I want to inspire them to change the world. But no one abstractly thinks about changing the world. Why do all the people that learn about changing the world never end up changing the world? It's because that is not the primordial thing. The primordial thing is we need to love the world. We need to be committed to the world. And naturally, you will organically decide to change it if it needs to be changed. And that's what it was a story of. Dave fell in love with one piece of land, saw that everything was interconnected, and ended up having to, in the words of Frances Willard, a pin she wore, who was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, one of the great forgotten organizations in American history. She had a pin that said, do everything. And so what you eventually have to do is everything. And the thing is, it wasn't a slog when you're doing everything. It's a total joy. It's filled with relationships. It's filled with purpose. It's filled with meaning. It's filled with fun. And Dave's an embodiment of that. And his wife, Annette. I could go into her, but I'll spare you. It's equal, if not more, of what she did for the town. So,
and I will say there's a lot of great examples of these kind of, I wouldn't, inspiring sounds like a trite word, but they are inspiring stories throughout this book. I've heard you describe the writing style as almost curatorial, kind of finding these little gems to present, and it really just comes out beautifully. So it's I always thought that story kind of crystallized a lot of the themes of the book. I don't know if we have any questions from folks. I know we're a little over an hour now. I know people probably have things to do and whatnot, so I want to just see if we have any.
Michael, I have a question. I was very interested in Elias's description of how a church ought to come back to the benefit of the citizens or the members of that church. And I just wondered if you had heard about what the recent reorganization of parishes that the Archbishop about maybe 2 or 3 years ago accomplished in Connecticut, in Hartford, where what he did is took typically 3 parishes, put them together under a new name, and had the priests rotate among the parishes for masses at different times, and therefore left parish houses underutilized. In most cases, 2 of the 3 are totally without residents at this point. And same could be said about the churches. And so it seems like what our Archbishop did was about the opposite to me of what you suggested. Yes. I just wonder if you had any further comment.
It's a painful thing to contemplate. I think the idea was we would hire some consultants who specialized in building, community connection. And so meetings were held all over Chicago. I think this really depended on where you lived. If you lived on the North Shore of Chicago and you're going to combine a couple of parishes, it's people kind of look alike. But when you got into the ethnic neighborhoods in Chicago, that was not true. And there was a lot of emotion and, personal histories and so on. It was very difficult. I mean, I don't know what it would have taken to pull it off successfully, really. So it's just a sort of sad story. I don't think it was everywhere a disaster, but there were a number of places where you just had, black and brown against each other in some ways, because one resented the fact they were being compelled to join the other's parish, and sometimes it was not very welcoming. So that was sad to hear about. Presumably there were some cases where it did go well, but it's only because the local people made it go well. It was, I think, just an unmanageable process to begin with. So I don't know how bad. I don't know if Chicago is the worst example. Maybe in other cases it was not like that.
Do you have any examples of where the benefits of the closing of a parish inured to the members of that parish?
I do not. I know some people that wanted to go to the Archdiocese in Chicago, and maybe other places too. And a place that big has a real estate committee, and the real estate committee probably means a couple of younger guys from the real estate industry. So they went to law school at Notre Dame or, wherever. But the truth is their analysis is no different from anybody else in the community. So when it comes to disposing of property and all of the obligations the Archdiocese might have, the legal issues around it, they are not really interested in hearing about ways to make a modest amount of money or even no money on the assets in order to benefit the community. That's just not likely to be considered. That's just the reality, which is a very sad thing.
Thank you, Peter, for that question.
Yeah.
Maybe we could spend just a few minutes before we close up, if both Elias and Pete, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about what you're currently working on. Pete, I'd love to hear a little bit more after perusing the website today about the Democracy Policy Network. If you could just share with our friends here what you guys are up to there. One thing that stayed with me, I like the idea, being kind of on the publishing side, you thought about structuring it almost like a magazine where people are bringing you policies and you're almost like, shepherding them into being. Could you just give us a little background?
So the big idea of the Democracy Policy Network is we're trying to raise up ideas that deepen democracy, particularly at the state level, but that's just the center of gravity. That's not, a rigid ground tree. And the idea is basically, I really believe in the project of deepening democracy in the broadest sense of the term. In the abstract, more power to more people in more ways, participation, freedom as participation and power, not just liberty for government, the idea that we all co-create our shared world. But when you start saying these flowery things about democracy, people say, well, what does that mean literally, besides voting or something? And what we believe it is it's a series of institutional reforms and, state policies that could achieve that, expand more power to more people. From interesting campaign finance reform models like democracy vouchers, this idea out of Seattle, to interesting democratizing the economy ideas like promoting cooperatives and different labor power things, to interesting community building ideas like social infrastructure, that Eric Kleinenberg idea about libraries and parks, to restorative justice over mass incarceration, all these different policies. And what we do is we write up policy kits on them that make it really easy to raise up those policies in your neck of the woods. So if you're a state legislator or you're a state advocate, you can go to Democracy Policy Network and find a menu of, we sometimes like think about ourselves as a policy grocery store, go find on the shelf different policies that you could advocate for. What's a good housing one? What's a good campaign finance one? What's a good prison reform one? And meanwhile, on the production side, we invite people to come write kits with us. So if anyone has any ideas they want to write up, we're a very open platform that, you go through an editorial process just like with a magazine. But it's not all written by me or the staff. It's written by mostly volunteers. So that's the idea there.
Excellent. Very exciting. And Elias, what's cooking at Solidarity Hall? I was curious if you could maybe speak a bit about Economy of Francesco for those
Sure.
of us who aren't familiar. And also, if you want to talk a bit about your Arizmendi translation, sounded really interesting.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if people noticed, but about around a little over a year and a half ago, maybe, Pope Francis had called a meeting in Assisi. It was in the middle of COVID, so it was mostly virtual, but it was called the Economy of Francesco. And so what he wanted to bring together were younger economists, academics, planners, social workers, people who are involved in business, startups, and so on. And they had a conversation about the new economy. What should it be? Is it the sharing economy? Is it the solidarity economy? Is it the civil economy? There actually are a number of different words that describe what I would say is kind of a grassroots upwelling of new forms of business, which maybe not everybody is even aware is going on, not only in Europe, but really around the world. So over 2 or 3 days, Pope Francis had some very high-level speakers, Nobel Prize winners and all of that. But then in the individual countries, these mostly, but not all younger people, went off and did their own thing, kind of in the aftermath. So in the States, some friends and I organized a U.S. Economy of Francesco group. We pulled together, for a Zoom call, 250 people just to talk about this. And so these were people who were already engaged in a lot of ways, not all Catholic. And now taking it one step further, there is kind of a core group that are attempting to create something called the Francesco Collaborative. And the idea here has to do with ownership, racial equity, community rebuilding, all of those sorts of themes. It is aimed at philanthropy, foundations, and the investment community. It is an attempt to create a new model of investment based in Catholic social teachings all the way down. And it's very exciting work. It's the kind of work that in some ways was already going on, so this sort of formalizes some of it. There is a group of Catholic foundations and philanthropists that are very interested in this work. You would not be surprised to learn a big group of them are the women religious, again, some of whom are very well funded. But they are doing innovative stuff in terms of creating new businesses, particularly Black and Brown-owned businesses, woman-owned businesses, where ownership is much more widely distributed. It's not 3 guys in California. It's like all the workforce, everybody, the whole restaurant, the busboy, he owns a piece of the business from the get-go. This is the missing thing, in terms of our tax base, in terms of our neighborhoods, in terms of sustaining our families. It is very difficult to do anymore. All the incentives are wrong. They are very perverse. So it takes a really deliberate effort to say, we're not going after conventional market returns in this particular investment model. We're going after something called community return. And that doesn't mean you're donating money. It just means you're probably going to make less and you're going to do a lot of good.
Is that the triple bottom line? I've heard that phrase about.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's no, that's I'd love to learn more. I was actually communicating with one of our contributors yesterday, Nicholas Hayes Mota, who I believe.
Yes. I just met him.
Yeah, he's involved with that. So I would love to learn more. Sounds
cool.
like a great thing. Well, this is great. I think this is probably a good place. I feel very kind of inspired and feel like I have a better sense of both the abstractions and the concrete, and feel ready to put them together. So if anybody has any further questions, we did have a nice comment from Jim, just with a quick recommendation about Peter Marin and Dorothy Day once said that every parish should have a Christ room or a house of hospitality.
Yeah.
So that's nice.
Yeah.
Nice idea for the parish renewal. We were talking strong parishes.
Exactly.
So thank you, Pete, and thank you, Elias. The book is
Michael, can I just
Sure.
ask Elias a question that has nothing to do with what he spoke about tonight?
Sure, Beth.
It's just that I used to live in South Bend, Indiana for 28 years.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering where you go to church, what?
Yep. I go to Holy Trinity Parish. I live on Portage Avenue in the near northwest neighborhood. And so I'm only about a mile from there. And that's the parish church for, I'm sorry, Holy Cross Parish. And that's the—
Oh, okay. I was going to say,
right.
I
not,
never
not Holy Trinity, Holy Cross. And that's
Right.
the parish church for Holy Cross College, which is a wonderful little college here in town. I like it much better than Notre Dame in a lot of ways.
I won't tell anybody who said that.
I thought you were going to ask me, why did you move to South Bend? Because I can
When
tell
did you
that
move there?
about a year ago.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And my answer is, it's nothing to do with Notre Dame. It had nothing to do with Mayor Pete. It had to do with the fact that in South Bend, there's a neighborhood that I hope is going to be one of the first in the country to figure out how to deal with gentrification. Which most people would say is impossible. There's no way to deal with it. It's just going to roll over you. Too bad. This neighborhood has some smart people in it, and they're organized, and they're, meeting up, and they are, strategizing with some long-range planning how they could avoid this fate. And I hope they can pull it off because, they have a lot of great ideas. And I think this is, practically impossible to do, but wouldn't it be a great thing if somebody could figure it out? So
It's funny though, that you go to a church that's associated with Holy Cross. I used to go to one that was associated with St. Mary's.
yes.
It almost seems like the regular churches that we would consider are not even considered one of the ones anybody would want to go to.
This is the first time I've ever been to a parish where the priest was formerly a community organizer.
Huh. Okay.
So that kind of rocked me a little bit.
Well, the neat thing about St. Mary's is the community is what the church is. There is no priest.
Huh. Oh, really?
Yeah, there's when I was out there, and I left there in 2013, when I was out there were about 10 priests that used to rotate. So, and I want to say, I think they were all associated with Notre Dame. I'm pretty sure that, but they were not what made the parish. And I think that's what made the place so wonderful is it was the people that formed the community.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Beth, for that.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Well, if there's no further questions, I mean, we could. I'd love to pick both of your brains about policy stuff and strong town stuff, but that's a whole other conversation. But thank you so much for your
Michael,
and coming together tonight. And again, Pete's book is dedicated. Dedicated. Why am I forgetting the subtitle? The Case for Commitment in an Age of Infinite Browsing. I'm sorry.
There you go.
But so check that out, please. And thank you both.
It is the anti-self-help book, is the way I think of it.
And I'm so grateful for you featuring it and having this conversation. It's wonderful, and I truly mean this. You and TAC and everyone who came today are an exemplar of sorry, this music just came on out of nowhere. You are an exemplar of the theme of the book.
Very good.
Thank you.
Fair enough.
all heroes. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
All right,
you.
everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And we're hopefully having another online gathering next month. We'll keep everybody posted. So
Cool.
thanks again for joining us.
Thanks.
Great.
Good night.
All right. Night, everybody.